In 1687, a man was brought to a prison on this island off the southern coast of France. He had already spent the previous 40 years in captivity, his face hidden behind an iron mask. He remains, without question, the most legendary prisoner in French history. But who was he? Although Dumas wrote about the man in the iron mask as a fictional character in one of his novels, I truly believe that there was a real historical figure behind the story. There genuinely was a man who wore an iron mask. He was confined in a cell that could only be reached through multiple layers of gates, ensuring that no one could ever overhear what he said. This was because it involved a scandal that King Louis's XIV could not allow to become public knowledge. The identity of the man in the iron mask stands as one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. No one was supposed to know who he was or why he was imprisoned, and his identification would have given that away. Why would he be both well cared for and forced to wear a mask? The only logical answer is that he was immediately recognizable. Concealing his identity must have been the purpose, and the most reasonable conclusion is that he looked like the king, possibly even his twin brother. On November 19, 1703, a tomb in the Bastille's St. Paul Cemetery received the body of a man who had been imprisoned for the last 4 decades of his life. He is undoubtedly the most famous prisoner in French history, but who was he? What was his crime? And why was he kept in near isolation with his face covered by that notorious iron mask? This man must have been someone very well known, or someone who closely resembled another person, or someone who possessed an enormous secret that they did not want anyone to discover. But for someone to endure a mask that was riveted onto the head, with only a mouthpiece for breathing, for 32 years, it is almost unbelievable that anyone could survive that. All we can say for certain about the alleged man in the iron mask is that he was a prisoner held in various prisons across France. He was kept in solitary confinement, yet he was treated remarkably well. What is strange is that no one ever recorded having seen his face. So, we do not know who he really was. The evidence becomes particularly interesting in 1789, during the French Revolution, when the Bastille was stormed. Among the mysterious discoveries inside was a skeleton still wearing an iron mask. The source that made this prisoner world famous is a story by Alexandre Dumas called "The Man in the Iron Mask," which he wrote at this very desk. Even though it is a work of fiction, it contains important historical details, and the author spent considerable time researching the history behind the tale. According to Dumas, the prisoner was none other than the twin brother of Louis's XIV, being only a few minutes older. He was the legitimate heir to the throne. The king had his brother imprisoned and forced him to wear an iron mask so that no one would ever notice the resemblance. Alexandre Dumas's theory is that the prisoner was the twin brother of King Louis XIV of France. Since there cannot be 2 kings, the best solution was to put one in an iron mask and lock him away. The twin brother of Louis XIV was a threat to the throne. As the king sought to secure his reign, he realized his brother could not be allowed to remain free. So, he got rid of him. He imprisoned him, but of course he was still his brother, so he treated him well, which, in fact, the man in the iron mask was. That theory is relatively plausible. Clearly, the person in the mask would have been instantly recognizable without it. And the only person who would have been instantly recognizable in those days was the king. Alexandre Dumas was known for masterfully blending fact with fiction. So, I think we can fairly conclude that the man in the Iron Mask was indeed the twin brother of Louis XIV. Another theory suggests that the man in the Iron Mask was not Louis XIV's twin, but actually his father. Louis XIII was considered too old to produce an heir, and an heir was desperately needed. Otherwise, his scheming brother would take the throne. It is believed that Cardinal Richelieu, the king's closest ally and spy master, instructed one of his musketeers to sleep with the queen and father a child, which he did. However, years later, the musketeer, now impoverished, tried to extort money from the king and Richelieu by threatening to expose the affair. At that point, the king threw him into prison, clamped an iron mask on his face, and thus the legend of the man in the Iron Mask was born. The old king, Louis XIII, was allegedly impotent and had been for some time when the boy destined to become Louis XIV was born. It was also noted that the strong, vigorous young prince bore no resemblance to his sickly, ailing father. One theory is that, through the machinations of certain highly placed people in the French court, the queen was impregnated by a vigorous young guardsman working for one of those courtiers. He was then imprisoned so that the secret could never be revealed. Basically, the real father of Louis XIV was making a fuss about this, perhaps demanding money, power, or titles, and was getting out of hand. So, he had to be dealt with. Of course, the other possibility is that in those days, Richelieu would have simply had him killed. So, that theory does not seem very likely. The reason this story has captivated people's imagination for hundreds of years is that, first, it remains unsolved. Second, there is this almost heroic figure who is treated regally. What did he know? Why wasn't he killed? And isn't it tragic that he had to live a life of solitary confinement? There is a sense of romance and mystery attached to it. Of course, it has been dramatized in films for decades, so it is quite popular and well-known, and I do not see it fading anytime soon. My next stop was to meet Jean, Christophe Petitfils, one of the most respected historians in France. He is an expert on Alexandre Dumas's work and believes that the story of the man in the Iron Mask is based on a real person who spent most of his life in prison. He even has a theory about who that person really was. Was the man in the Iron Mask a real historical figure? There is very little documentary evidence to help unravel this mystery, presumably because the people behind it wanted every trace of this prisoner and his imprisonment destroyed. But Jean Christophe has published an original letter in his book that actually discusses the imprisonment of a man who wore an iron mask. It seems Dumas's story was indeed based on a real person. This is a very important document, the first one that mentions the prisoner by the name of the man with an iron mask. This is evidence that there was a prisoner who wore an iron mask. It says that the prisoner arrived at the prison of Saint Marguerite with a steel or iron mask on his face. It details that the prisoner was moved from exile to Saint Marguerite near Cannons. This is hard evidence that he really existed. The fact that the story of the man in the iron mask became so intriguing so quickly shows that it was extraordinary for its time, when political prisoners often simply disappeared into the system. I have come to the village of Langres, about 3 hours southeast of Paris. In this museum, they claim to have the mask that the prisoner actually wore. The mask was discovered at a street market at the end of the 19th century before changing hands several times and ending up here. It is not on public display, so the curator, Olivier Common, arranged to have it brought up from the archives for me to see. This is the actual mask. It is very difficult to say if it is the real one. It was discovered by a scrap dealer in Lyon in 1895. A woman bought it from an antiquarian, who later gave it to the museum. The holes on the mask were likely used to attach it to the face. There was a small paper label inside the mask, now lost, with an inscription from 1703 saying that the mask was removed from the face of the twin brother of King Louis XIV. That makes it very important and suggests it could be the real Iron Mask. There is also a small keyhole, indicating the mask might have been locked onto the face. We cannot be certain that this is the actual mask worn by the prisoner. It might be real, or it might belong to someone else, but it is still an extraordinary artifact. The mask in the museum is interesting because it has an androgynous appearance, but it only covers the front of the face. It does not cover the hair, head, or sides of the face, so it seems unlikely that it would have been enough to hide the identity of a truly important man. There is no conclusive evidence linking it to the man in the Iron Mask. Masks like this turn up at flea markets across France, but there is no viable proof that this is the actual one used. It looks more like a death mask than anything else, and the original mask was supposed to have been riveted on the prisoner, covering both front and back. This is not what is seen in the museum. It was highly unusual for a prisoner to wear an iron mask. Prisons in those days were harsh places, with prisoners often barely clothed and kept in dungeons. So, a man of regal status wearing an iron mask at all times would have stood out dramatically. That was not normal. It was said that the man in the iron mask was kept in solitary confinement for most of his life, allowed contact only with a select few, including his musketeer guards. If he ever spoke of anything other than his immediate needs, they had orders to execute him immediately. Unusually, he had the same jailer throughout his entire imprisonment. The French prison warden, B.A. 9 d'Auvergne de Saint-Mars. What is really interesting is his jailer, a very ambitious man who rose through the ranks and specifically asked to be associated with the man in the Iron Mask. They remained together for 34 years. The relationship between them must have been extraordinary. It seems the jailer understood that this was an important individual, possibly royal, or someone with a secret so great that they could not be killed. Saint-Mars actually took on the extra title of Saint-Mars, which made him feel special. He took on the care of this possibly royal prisoner for the rest of his life, moving him between 4 different prisons over 32 years. He looked after him so well that he was heard calling him, "Oh, my prince." A saint, Mars was a very ambitious man, and if there had been an opportunity for promotion or favor from Louis XIV in return for trustworthiness and secrecy, he would have done it. There is a lot of evidence that the governors of the prisons treated the man in the mask with deference and awe, as if he were a person of status. Other prisoners would doff their caps and call him, "My prince." While it could have been sarcastic, taken together with everything else, it probably was not. He probably was a person of status. In 1687, the man in the Iron Mask was transferred to a remote island off the coast of Cannes in southern France, to a prison known as Fort Royal. A special cell block was constructed just for him to keep him in total isolation. And it is still accessible today. I met local historian Christophe Roustan de la Tour, who agreed to show me around. This was once a fort standing on the border of France in those days. There was a military garrison there. But the prisons were built specifically for the arrival of the man in the Iron Mask in 1687. They were built to his specifications, suggesting he was quite an important person. The cell remains in a pristine state, just as he would have seen it. Saint Mars brought a troop of musketeers with him. The prisoner arrived on April 30, 1687. Coming from his previous prison in the Italian Alps, it was not common for prisoners to wear iron masks. There is no trace of any other prisoner wearing one. The mask was probably not a punishment, but a way to hide his face. The most recognizable figure in the land would have been the king, which has led to many theories about the Iron Mask's identity in relation to the king. It is said that the prisoner was visited by King Louis XIV's sister-in-law, Elizabeth Charlotte. Afterwards, she wrote to her Aunt Sophia, saying she had seen the prisoner in his cell, with 2 musketeers at his side ready to kill him if he removed his mask. She described him as very devout, well-treated, and receiving everything he desired. A great fuss was made over this man. The problem with twins is that one is born before the other and would be the heir to the throne. But who would know which was which? One was probably more cunning than the other, and one was locked away in an iron mask. The whole idea was that no one was allowed to speak to him or see him, because if that mask came off, someone might exclaim, "Good heavens! It's the king!" And the poor man spent the rest of his days in darkness. This is the first cell where he was kept for 11 years. It is quite spacious, about 20 square meters, with a chimney, a latrine, and a large window with a nice view of the sea. He had some furnishings, and it was probably more comfortable than what the soldiers had. The soldiers must have speculated about his identity. The cell was built to his specifications, indicating he was indeed an important person. I think the best candidate for the man in the Iron Mask is a man named Eustache Dogger, but we do not know exactly who he was. What we know is that he had some state secret. He might have seen or participated in something he was sworn to secrecy about under pain of death. But would people have recognized Eustache Dogger? No. So why would he wear a mask? I have no idea. The lore propagated by Voltaire and others suggests he had a connection to the identity of the king. He was incarcerated because he was a threat to the dynasty or the king himself. Whether that is true or not, we do not know. It is possible he was related to Louis XIV, but I do not think we will ever find out for certain. The people of that time were very cautious and secretive, so the true identity and crime may remain unknown. Based on how the man in the Iron Mask was treated, the idea that he was a member of the French royal family makes sense. The comfortable private prison, the Royal Musketeer Guards, and the mask itself all point to that. The only reason for the mask would be that he was instantly recognizable. I think Alexandre Dumas got it right. There is a strong case that he was the twin of King Louis XIV. As the king's brother, Louis XIV would treat him well. He would not kill his own brother. He just wanted the throne. So, he kept him in isolation with a mask so no one would recognize him as the rightful heir. On September 18, 1698, Saint Mars was transferred again, becoming governor of the Bastille in Paris, and he brought his masked prisoner with him. The Bastille jail no longer stands, but eyewitness accounts from the time confirm that a prisoner was kept there in isolation under heavy security, wearing an iron mask. He died on November 19, 1703, after nearly 40 years in prison. A skeleton was found in his cell. its skull still encased in an iron mask. In 1789, when the Bastille was stormed during the French Revolution, revolutionaries broke into one of the deepest dungeons and found the remains of a skeleton chained to the wall, still wearing an iron mask. Ironically, the mask made the prisoner even more noticeable. No one stands out in a prison unless they are a raving lunatic, but this man did. There are many historical accounts of him being seen in various prisons or on boats between them. Voltaire mentions that he was seen in the Bastille wearing the iron mask, which helped create the legend. There are reports of people entering his cell, removing their hats and bowing to him, and of Saint Mars calling him "my prince." This suggests a royal personage. One question kept bugging me. What was it like to actually wear an iron mask? Presumably, it was uncomfortable, difficult to see, hear, and eat with. My French producer, Eduardo Flaherty, arranged for a blacksmith, Olivier Finot, to make one using 17th century tools and methods. Olivier is one of the most famous blacksmiths in the region, and he agreed to make a mask like those from the 17th and 18th centuries. He heated, molded, and shaped every piece, taking 30 hours to complete it. The mask was heavy and terrifying to hold. When I tried it on, it was horrific, uncomfortable, heavy and restrictive. I could not imagine spending a day in it, let alone 4 decades. It must have been a living hell. Whoever came up with this was a cruel man. Wearing that mask for more than a few moments would have been painful and difficult. It restricted hearing and vision. Weighing 3 or 4 kilograms, the prisoner would have been lucky to survive a year wearing it, not 30 years. If it is true that he was forced to wear such a mask at all times, the most logical conclusion is that he was instantly recognizable or bore a strong resemblance to someone else, most likely the king, that he was the twin brother of Louis XIV, as Alexandre Dumas suggests, is by far the most likely scenario. Unable to kill his brother, the king removed him from court and imprisoned him for life. If this is true, it is a tragic tale. A man of royal blood not only locked away, but tortured with a heavy mask on his face for 32 years in a dreadful prison cell. Yet, when his jailer entered, they always removed their hats and bowed to him. The story of the man in the iron mask fascinates us because it is a great conspiracy story full of intrigue and mystery. We love a good mystery as human beings. I believe the man in the iron mask was a real historical figure, not a work of fiction. The question is, who was he? There are 2 or 3 good candidates, but I am not sure we will ever know. Everything points to the hand of power coming down from the monarchy through Richelieu to control this man even beyond his last breath. He is undoubtedly one of the most famous prisoners of all time, but is it possible to say who he really was? For me, the nature of his imprisonment, the isolation, the high security, and the iron mask suggests it was vital to keep his identity secret. The theory that he was Louis XIV's brother makes a lot of sense, an older brother, a legitimate heir, brutally erased from history.